and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, the top diplomats of China, Russia, and India are in New Delhi for the 15th Russia-India-China Foreign Ministers meeting. Can this thrill and some of the conflicts that still grip the world? And I sit down with Booker Prize-winning author Thomas Keneally, who wrote Schindler's Arc. We uncovered the inspiration for the novel that went on to become an Oscar-winning screenplay. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi and his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, are in New Delhi for the 15th Russia-India-China Foreign Ministers meeting. They met with Indian External Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj. Afterwards, the trio released a statement saying they don't want to see an escalation of tensions on the Korean Peninsula. The three diplomats also discussed regional trade and further cooperation. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is China's first senior official to visit India since border tensions flared in the Donglang region in June.
政策沟通，设施联通。
We will promote connectivity building of the Eurasian continent following the principle of extensive consultation, joint contribution, and shared benefits, committing to a policy of infrastructure, trade, financial, and people-to-people connectivity, to ensure that our connectivity initiatives complement instead of contradict each other, and supplement instead of conflict with each other, to foster regional integration. We have also had discussions on Afghanistan, the Middle East, and other international hotspot regional issues, and reached consensus on these issues.
And for more on this foreign ministers meeting, we are joined in our Beijing studio by Rong Ying, who is the vice president of CIIS, China Institute of International Studies. Welcome, sir. In Moscow, we are joined by Mark Sleboda, international relations and security analyst. In New Delhi, India, we have Uday Bhaskar, who is a director of the Society for Policy Studies. He's a retired commodore who served in the Indian Navy and one of India's leading experts, outspoken critics on security and strategic issues. I want to welcome the three of you. The three countries' foreign ministers finally sat down today and met with one another. How important is RIC, as they say, Russia, India, China? This is the 15th already.
Oh, yeah, I think this is a very important framework for three major countries in the Eurasia, as I said. Remember back in 1998, when the former Prime Minister of Russia, Primakov, put forward officially this idea, this vision. I mean, that the world 20 years ago was different from today. But at that time, I think a lot of people were speculating or were saying that it is possible. And what will be the significance of that? Now, 20 years later, the three countries not only sit together, the foreign ministers, for 15 times, starting with a kind of a meeting at the sideline of international conference, UN and other, later on become a stand-alone meeting like that. Now I see that it is more, the voices are louder, the messages are clear, and more importantly, I see that the efforts of the three countries, despite that there are some differences, bilateral problems, now they want to strengthen their coordination to make sure that they can help to address or manage the issues in the region and the world.
Well, they sat down, they expressed their determination, but whether they will be able to do that, it's another question. Let me talk about some of those questions. Mr. Bhaskar from India. China-India had some border issues earlier. This is the very first time the foreign ministers met in India in this trilateral situation. Having said that, though, some of the issues are not yet resolved. Whether there will be high-level meetings between the two countries for further discussion about the border, whether the two countries will be able to work on some of the differences on other important issues such as BRI is still unknown. Mr. Bhaskar.
First of all, thank you for inviting me
Great
to your
have
show.
You, sir.
And I just want to add that I had the privilege of listening to Mr. Primakov personally in 1995-96 before he became the Prime Minister. It was after the end of the Cold War, and he was visiting New Delhi and in our institute, and he spoke about this Russia, India, China framework. And at that time, I distinctly remember he did make the observation that this is a very important forum so that we could have multipolarity as a reality. But he underlined the fact that there would be certain divergences, differences between these three countries as they were coping with the end of the Cold War. So I would say from 96, 97 to where we are now 20 years later, what you have said is right. India and China have gone through a certain experience over the last few months as far as this unresolved border and territorial issue is concerned. But concurrently, I think there is a certain political consensus between Russia, India and China that there are a number of global issues where this kind of a sitting down and at least exchanging their thoughts and ideas is very valuable as an exercise in high-level political consultation about, as I said, a number of issues where Moscow, Delhi and Beijing can offer an alternate viewpoint from what may be seen as the dominant view till now. So I personally think this is a very important forum, notwithstanding the fact that we have had differences between India and China on the Doklam issue, as you mentioned in your opening remarks.
One of the very interesting things is that, Mr. Sloboda, after this meeting of the three foreign ministers, we are going to see India, Japan, and also Australia foreign ministers get together tomorrow. It's quite a frequency, I would say, when it comes to these kinds of important trilateral meetings, but that will be of a very different nature. So, Mr. Sloboda, what nature really is this meeting, this trilateral meeting, when the three are eager to work on global issues? Are they able to work on bilateral issues at all?
Yeah, I hate the sound of voice of pessimism coming after these effusive statements towards the forum that was first proposed by the Russian Foreign Minister, Yevgeny Primakov, coming from Moscow. But I think I have to. The RIC Forum has the potential to be a truly important forum on the world stage, not only in Eurasia, but as a stability and pillar of the international order, but it is not. Unfortunately, in recent years, tensions between India and China and India's increasing flirtations geopolitically with the United States have reduced the forum to pretty much a talking shop. You don't see initiatives, you don't see actions out of the RICS forum. You see vaguely worded statements of intent. Now, it's always good when the three to get together to talk, but as you pointed out, this increasing cooperation, the U.S. is trying to draw India into its conflicts, its hegemonic tensions with China in the South China Sea. This is this Australia, Japan, U.S., India. Donald Trump has started using the words Indo-Pacific, which is an entirely new buzzword geopolitical phrase, simply trying to frame and draw India into the U.S.'s conflict with China in the South China Sea.
On that point, I would like to go back to Mr. Bhaskar. On the one hand, the U.S. already talked about the concept, which was not new, so-called Indo-Pacific, without giving any specific explanation of it. India later said that we are not really interested in. We want to have so-called balanced foreign policy. But we are seeing some very interesting multilateral consultations going on over the past few weeks and probably for days to come regarding India and its relations with the United States, some of its allies also in Asia. So, Mr. Bhaskar, what exactly is India's balanced foreign policy? How does India now see itself? Does it see as a big bargaining power it has toward all kinds of camps, including toward China, Russia, and toward the United States?
Well, I would describe India's current foreign policy orientation as one that would like to have the equivalent of a stable and a robust engagement with all the major powers. We have occasionally used the word multi-aligned, saying that during the Cold War, India was non-aligned, but we are aware that there was a greater empathy between New Delhi and Moscow during the Cold War, particularly the second phase of the Cold War, when Beijing had moved closer to Washington. But that was the Cold War. Now I would say that the Indian objective is to have a stable, robust relationship with all the major powers, and we are talking about Washington, Beijing and Moscow in the first instance. Now I did hear this comment from our panelist from Moscow to say that, quote unquote, India is engaging in a flirtatious relationship with the United States. I think that needs to be qualified, which is that yes, India and the United States were seen as estranged democracies for more than 3 decades, and very often our American interlocutors remind us that after Cuba, during the Cold War, India had the record of voting against the United States for the maximum number of times on a number of issues. But in the last decade, there has been an improvement between India and the United States. And most recently, this reference to the Indo-Pacific, which again has been referred to, I think this is a logical extension from the Asia-Pacific, which, if you remember, was the term that was used during the first decade after the end of the Cold War. There is a sense that the maritime domain is becoming more relevant. And just as China is looking at the Indian Ocean with a fair amount of interest, India is also conscious of the maritime domain. And this quadrilateral that you mentioned, the consultation between India, United States, Japan and Australia, if you remember the statement that each of these countries had issued, they made it very clear that this is a consultative process, it's a work in progress, and they want to see what steps they can take to provide good order at sea in the Indo-Pacific, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean.
Mr. Rong Ying, here in Beijing, if you just look at the camera, some people have been saying so-called the Indo-Pacific concept, even though old, it is likely to be an extension of the so-called rebalancing Asia, which was adopted by the Obama administration. So this time, when the RIC leaders, foreign ministers, met, it becomes extremely important right before the end of the year. Mr. Rong, what does China make of this interesting relationship with both Russia and India? When global issues are discussed, will bilateral issues and bilateral trust be established?
Well, China, I think, as I said, continue to stress importance to bilateral and also trilateral engagement with the two countries. We believe that despite the fact, even with Russia, it's been very clear, I think that the bilateral relationship has been at a very high level, and I mean full kind of coordination and consultation as being satisfactory. With India, I think, as we all know, that there are some differences, even though I think there's a recognition that the strategic convergence are more than the specific differences. But it is true, I think, if you look at the media, look at the academic level, there are a lot of concerns. I think the concerns, I think, to some extent also echo the Russian colleagues' the view that what India is up to. I think, to be fair, that India has its own national interest to take care of, and it is also right, I mean, for India to make whatever policy choices do. The question is that I think if you look at this initiative, let's say the Indo-Pacific, we all know that that was a kind of a development or evolution of a kind of diamond, I mean, initiated by Japan 10 years ago. So 10 years later, at that time, India was not so enthusiastic, but 10 years later, now India is becoming part of enthusiastic.
Interesting.
But the more interesting is the specifics. The initiative and the specific cooperation or consultation. There are much more, I think, nuances we need to look at. So
let's take a look at some of the nuances, not necessarily about Indo-Pacific, but rather the bilateral relations among these three countries. China and India, we talk about the border issue, we talk about the BRI issue, and here is the relationship that China has with Pakistan, yet India and Pakistan, so we all know there are still issues that they haven't worked out. So what about those that would likely to have an impact on BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, would have an impact on China-India border issue, would have an impact on the connectivity, which is a big issue for both countries. And Mr. Rong, very briefly, if you can, very briefly, from you and also the Indian guys.
That's exactly we are having asking the question. I mean, the initiative like BRI and others, and almost all the countries, I mean, support that. But there are only few countries, which I think, I would say, to be fair, India is the only country that have expressed reservation or opposition.
Okay.
So now I think it's fair for Chinese to ask, well, on the Indo-Pacific initiative like that, India supports that, and China's initiative, why it has reservation?
Okay.
So this is, I think, I got some questions.
Got some questions, Mr. Bhaskar from India. You want to respond to that, but 30 seconds if you can. We have very limited time.
Well, quick response is that India's reservations about the Belt Road and Initiative is because the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is an important part of this initiative, passes through territory that is India's as part of the dispute after 1947. It is referred to as Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. And I just want to make this point through your television channel.
Very briefly,
saying that when territoriality and disputed borders are so sensitive, I think Beijing should also have been aware of this issue before proceeding ahead with this initiative.
Okay, let's talk about China and Russia too, or Russia and India as well. At this point, Mr. Sleboda, there are connectivity issues between Russia and India. We understand the so-called north-south transportation line, which spans about 7,500 kilometers railway, likely to be built, and there's likely to be new port in Iran, for example, which provides the entry of a sea route for many of the Western Asian countries. What about that? How is that likely to be? What does that mean for the Eurasian corridor? How is that vis-a-vis, you know, the Belt and Road Initiative from your perspective, Mr. Sleboda?
Yeah, well, Russia really is the linchpin and the pivot point of this relation between the RIC countries. Russia historically has very good relations with India, although they have perhaps been more substantial in the past. They've pretty much been reduced to military technical cooperation. This north-south corridor is an attempt by Russia to provide balancing, to reassure India, as well as the obvious benefits of trade, to the One Belt, One Road initiative, which will stretch all the way from China through Russia and Central Asia into Europe and Asia. It's a balancing, and it was quite deliberately fast-tracked by Russia in order to reassure India, to balance the relation between the two. Between Russia and China, relations have never been better. There's a vast improvement over the Cold War. I think we really need to speak about these relations. We can stop talking about strategic partnership and start talking about a strategic alliance. Where the three countries do have things in common, I think the economics is at cross points at this point, but is still on the Security Council, in the UN, in the defense of the UN core principles of sovereignty and non-interference, which have been under Western assault, with the right to protect and various regime changes around the world. That's where we still have the most substantial common ground between the three.
Very briefly, 30 seconds, Mr. Rong. Alliance, is that what China has in mind?
No, that's not China is looking for. I think we're talking about a partnership. Partnership, not alliance. But definitely, I think that also means, I mean, China has clearly aware that all the three countries, including China itself, is a sovereign independent state. We don't see, I think, alliance will serve the interest of us.
Before we go, I do have an interesting and important question for Mr. Sloboda coming from Russia. Russian president in Syria talking about Russian troops withdrawing from that country. This is one of a quite significant moment, I would say, for Russia, particularly for the Middle East, the role it is playing. We know it is evolving so fast there. So what would that mean for Russia's role in the region, West Asia and the Middle East, and how would that have an impact for Russia's relationship, whether with China or with India, these emerging countries? Very briefly from you, Mr. Sloboda.
Yeah, I think this is a mission accomplished moment. It's only one of several that have already occurred. I wouldn't expect too much withdrawal of Russian forces, more a rotation as we've seen frequently. On one hand, the statement is for domestic politics, shoring up the president's push for re-election next year with assuring that he's had a military victory. On the other hand, it is a message to the United States, which has recently reiterated that they intend to remain in eastern Syria indefinitely. It's once again warning them that, you know, what figment of legal remit they had to be in East Syria is gone with the defeat of ISIS, and they need to pack their bags and get out. And this is still a potential flashpoint for tensions between the U.S., Russia, and Turkey in Syria.
Of course, the Russian president is likely to be in Turkey very soon as we speak. There are so many things going on all at the same time, in a way illustrating China, Russia, and India all trying to struggle to find out their new role in a dramatically changing world and dramatically changing regions. Thank you so much for the three of you gentlemen for being with us. Rong Ying, Mark Sloboda, and Uday Bhaskar. Really appreciate it. Thank you. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you live from Beijing. Still to come on our program, we revisited the life and times of Nazi Germany in Schindler's Ark, written by Booker Prize winner author Thomas Keneally. We uncovered the inspiration for his book right after this break. History Revealed. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Next, we bring back a piece of World War II history. A Nazi party member became an unlikely hero by saving 1,200 Jews from concentration camps all over Poland and Germany. That is the plot of the historical fiction Schindler's Ark. And it was later adapted into the highly successful film Schindler's List. Earlier, I sat down with the author, Booker Prize winner, Australian novelist Thomas Keneally, and he shared with me what inspired him to write the story of the World War II. But before our interview, let's take a look at this.
In 1993, the American historical film Schindler's List did the rounds of world movie festivals. With 7 Oscars, 7 BAFTAs, and 3 Golden Globes, it first introduced to a wild audience the name of Oskar Schindler, a German businessman, a Nazi party member, war profiteer, yet also a man who saved over 1,100 Jews from concentration camps during the Holocaust. The movie was based on the novel Schindler's Ark, written by Australian author Thomas Keneally, who is neither German nor Jewish. Mr. Keneally got to know Schindler's story from Leopold Page, one of the survivors in Schindler's factory. Page made it his life mission to tell the story of Schindler, and Keneally helped him to fulfill it. When the famous Jewish-American director Steven Spielberg first read the novel, he was unsure if he was ready to make a film about the Holocaust. But finally he made up his mind to tell the story of how the Jews suffered through the eyes of an unlikely good Samaritan, Oskar Schindler, who proved to be righteous.
Oskar, there are 1,100 people who are alive because of you. Look at them. If I'd made more money.
What was it like for you as a writer to go through that process?
Well, I thought it would be easier than it was. But the point is that the build-up of detail about the barbarity of humans lives with you all the time because you're obsessed with it. You think just like a journalist thinks, I can get in, get the story, and get out. But it doesn't always happen. It stays with you. And I can remember having a very dark time in the middle of the book. But my dark time was nothing like the dark time the former prisoners had had.
How long was the dark time?
A month. It happens to a lot of writers that they have a crisis in the middle of their book. And in the middle of their book, they can lose faith in what they're doing. And that's terrible because it takes so long to get to that point.
So actually you got two crises going on. One is the writer's crisis in the middle of the book. And the other is the emotional crisis because you have to you really melt yourself into these stories before you can put them onto the paper.
People had died to make this story. Schindler saved a small number, but people had died as part of this story, and I couldn't forget that and couldn't fail to be haunted by it.
How did you struggle against yourself in order to get out of that trap?
Well, I lived in Sydney on a beach, a surfing beach. So I would go to the beach, a long way from Europe. I would go to football matches. I would go to restaurants and drink wine. So gradually, after a couple of weeks, you begin to feel better about it. You get your strength and you get your psychological strength and your courage back.
So namely, Australia helps you. The great outdoor and the great wine.
Absolutely. Writing it in the new world instead of in the old world where it happened was a great help.
Movies about wars usually could fall into a trap. Good men versus bad men. Good people versus bad people. But in your book, I find it a bit more complicated than that. I
should disclaim that I ever spoke to Schindler. If I'd had a chance to talk to him, I know I would have liked him because the stories were about him being a good guy, relaxed. A man who had no money at that stage of his life, but who always over-tipped. A man who had no money but could always find the money to buy another cognac. I'm sure I would have liked him. He, like I, was a Catholic. And were not the sort of Catholics bishops would have approved of. And so I liked the fact that he was a Catholic. On top of that, he was flawed. I wouldn't have to be reverent to him because he was a bad husband. He used people as cheap labor.
Yes, because that's why he wanted to have these people originally. Originally,
and he always wanted to be rich. He always intended he'd make a killing out of the war. And at the end of the war, he lost everything, of course. And after the war, he couldn't get back into being wealthy because he didn't have those Jewish engineers who were his prisoners and the Jewish accountants to look after him. So it's a great contradiction, a man who can only succeed when society's turned upside down and can chiefly succeed when he has help from his prisoners, at the same time respects the humanity of his prisoners. And he, at the end of the film and of the book, his prison was full. Now, when I say mention the film, that's one of my small criticisms about the film. I think the film is a fine film. But at the end of the film, he says, if I'd sold this badge, I could have saved one more. If I'd sold the car, I could have saved 10 more. In fact, his camp was already very full. While wanting to be sincerely rich, he had an amiable regard for the humanity of these other people. He knew that they were his brothers in the human race, as simple as that. At the same time as being a black marketeer, a scoundrel, and a great... he could confuse officials. He could bombard them with documentation. He could bribe them with diamonds, as he does in the film and does even more in the book. And he was an extraordinarily confident man.
So the question really is, what is this really about? Is this about bigger cause, or this is about the bottom line of human instincts?
Yes, it's interesting that you can indoctrinate people to hate other people, and the indoctrination is often successful with quite intelligent people. Oscar was a boy from the country, and yet he's
an outlier in a way. He's almost like an outlier in a way.
Yes, indeed. He is too much of a rebel to be influenced by the conditioning that says to the children and to adolescents and to others, you must hate this group because they're a danger to your civilization. And they're not human anyhow. So you don't have to, they're louse. You don't have to worry about killing them off. It's interesting that he evaded that, that conditioning. And in any case, he was a part of the book that he was an agent of German military intelligence as well. So he was spying for them on the SS, and that was an interesting part of his... But when the film was made and Spielberg cut it down, it was 6.5 hours long, and then he cut it down to 3 1/4. So he did a good job to get it down to 3 1/4, but he had to just concentrate on this idea of rescue and ambiguity. What I liked about Spielberg, who should I be to say that? Why should I be the one to say that when he's a far more famous director than I am a writer? But the truth is that I respected his taste for showing in the film just how mixed Oscar's motives were, just how ambiguous he was.
Mr. Keneally, what is it like for you? I mean, as a writer, the book was big.
Yes.
You won a Booker Prize for it. Then it was getting even bigger because of the movie. But you know, the book itself was about the worst nature of human being. The book itself is about hundreds of thousands of deaths during the war, and the uncertainty of human nature for the future. How do you read so many messages all at the same time personally?
I was raised a Catholic. I don't think I'm a Catholic anymore, but we were told that we had original sin, that we were born imperfect. And that imperfection, that struggle between reason and brutalism, brutal reactions, that we're given our reason to try to control. That struggle has just always fascinated me from childhood. In myself, too. One of the reasons I wanted to write that book was to ask myself, how would I have behaved in that situation?
How?
Am I confident that I wouldn't, under the orders of my officers and under the conditioning of a young lifetime, do what they did? And I'm scared that I don't know the answer. I'm scared that I might. And so I deliberately set out to pluck those strands out, because, as you say, people had died in great numbers, and they deserved that their deaths shouldn't be written off simply, that the full complexity of both death and survival, and of goodness and malice. And the prisoners told me this. The prisoners said, whenever we met Schindler after the war, we would ask him why he did it. Mm-hmm. And it depended on the day. He'd say one thing, then in a couple of days' time he'd completely contradict himself. Then he'd say something again the following week, and so on. Every time they asked him that question, Poldek said it was a different answer.
It was decades ago when you wrote the book.
Yes. I was young. I had a little bit of hair.
And now, very different. Decades later, you learn life much more than you did then, I guess.
Yes.
And you go through this huge fame, a lot of spotlight as a result of it. You are now much more matured, shall I say,
yes,
than you used to be. When you reflect upon what you wrote and this man, have things changed in your mind?
No. In fact, it's interesting. The thing that always worried me is that despite all the evidence for the story I told, ultimately someone would come along with another story and say, no, he got it all wrong. This is, Schindler's had a third motive for, and that hasn't happened. Now, Mrs. Schindler...
Were you scared about that possibility?
I was scared about that possibility. Mrs. Schindler said at the time that she was never consulted, but she was, both by myself and by Spielberg, exhaustively, but the point was that she was his abandoned wife. Mm. She was in an interesting position. A man who's left you suddenly becomes a hero to the world and a byword for goodwill to other humans.
That's right.
And he didn't show you much goodwill. And so she was angry with, I think, with the fact that her husband became has become a famous man and a byword for human sensitivity, human kindness. And but her story is part of the fascination of the story for an outsider, because her story of him is very ambiguous. And a lot of people said when it came to feeding women by hand, sick women by hand, she was the one who'd do that in the camp. Oscar was too busy drinking and talking and, you know, doing big stuff.
It's a very interesting man, isn't it?
Yes, he is. And I don't think he was a philosopher or a saint, you see. If he'd been a saint, he could only have died with those people. He couldn't have saved them.
But the question is, has there ever been a saint?
Well, that's a good question to ask an old Catholic. Possibly not. There've always been, we've always been, there have been men and women who know themselves and try to, and because they know themselves, they're kind to others. And that is a great thing. It's a wonder we're not all killers, because we're pretty savage animals, but we're not. We can sit together and talk. And I would hate to think of you starving. I would bring you food.
Because that's your moral bottom line.
Yes, but if I was shot for bringing you food, would I still bring you the food? That's the acid test.
All interesting questions to be raised. You love history.
Yes, indeed. I've written a lot of history.
Some say history is only the version of story that the winners wants to tell.
Ah, yes, but novelists tell about history so they can tell the true story from the point of view of ordinary people. So novelists are great subversives. It is true the victors tell the story, but some events are so huge and there's so much documentation for them that you can't escape them.
So actually, who is writing fictions? The writers, the novelists, or the historians?
Well, I think we're both writing, but historians do more research. I've written history too, and you can't escape the person you are when you write history. So it's as if if you wrote a history and I wrote a history, it's like having a big mass of dough called history and some cookie cutters. You have those in China, don't you?
We do.
And you're one cookie cutter, and you cut your cookie out of that mass of dough, and I'm a different cookie cutter. You're shaped like a diamond, I'm shaped like a spade, and so my version of that dough will be different from your version.
History needs a lot of missionaries who can really talk about at least what they saw ever happened. Yes, and may they continue to come. I can't wait for the novels of a new generation of Chinese writers. Mr. Keneally, what a pleasure. Thank you once again for sharing your precious time. Thank you. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.